Good evening and welcome to all of you who are joining us from all across the nation for the Progressive Hour. In pursuit of wholeness, listen to the women. I am Reverend Dr. Jacqueline A. Thompson, Senior Pastor of the Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California. I am also pleased to serve as the co-chair of the Women in Ministry Initiative for the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And we come to you as the convention prepares to celebrate 60 years of fellowship, progress, service, and peace. And so we thought it appropriate that in these 60 years, it's good to reflect, it's good to celebrate, but we also want to see how far we have come as it relates to women in ministry, to female clergy. And we have a dynamic group, an amazing group of men and women who are clergy, who are trailblazers in their own right, who are going to serve as our conversation partners tonight. And the basis of our conversation, of course, is the incredible book written by our very own Dr. Marvin A. McMickle, former president of Colgate Rochester Divinity School, retired, and the title of the book is Let the Oppressed Go Free. I am so blessed that he has agreed to join us tonight as co-moderator, and we are grateful to Judson Press for being our partner. And so if you do not have the book, we invite you to go to judsonpress.com right now so you can purchase the book. But much of our discussion is going to be based on some of the issues that he raised in that text. And so although everyone is here needs no introduction, it is only right that we introduce them anyway. So we certainly first welcome our very own Dr. Leslie D. Callahan, Senior Pastor of the St. Paul's Church in Philadelphia, first woman to serve in that capacity. In the same right, we welcome none other than Dr. Gina M. Stewart, the pastor of Christ Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, first woman to serve in that capacity. We are grateful for Reverend Dr. Ambassador Susan Johnson, who we all know, international influencer, third generation female business owner, pastor, first pastor of a 200-year-old church in American Baptist churches, and just a trailblazer all across the world. We are grateful for our very own Reverend Dr. Brenda Gurton Mitchell, who is the Minister of Stewardship and Missions at the historic Metropolitan Baptist Church in Largo, Maryland. She is also special advisor to the president of PMBC, and if truth be told, she's special advisor to lots of folks nationwide because of her administrative prowess and certainly because of her expertise in bringing people together. And last but certainly not least, Reverend Dr. Martha C. Taylor, who is an associate minister and historian at Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. And you may not know, but she is also the first female historian of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And co-moderating, we've already mentioned Reverend Dr. Marvin McMickle. And so, Dr. Taylor, you might find this interesting, but in preparing for our conversation tonight, I went back to the book, A Call to Greatness, which actually listed some of the historical documents in the founding of PMBC. So in 1961, between that weekend of November 15th and 16th, there were 23 delegates that showed up in Ohio at Zion in Cincinnati for that first organizational meeting. They listed who the 23 people were. And no matter how they try and keep us out, you know, it was one woman in the mix. Miss Thelma Watson was a messenger. She was from Antioch Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. But that is all we know, is that Thelma Watson was one of the messengers. Everyone else was clergy and was male. And so it raised for me actually a quote that comes from Let the Oppressed Go Free about the invisible woman. And the quote says, it seems that African-American men who have worked tirelessly to reverse the status of the invisible man, a term coined by Ralph Ellison, have found ways to keep women as invisible as possible in the ranks of leadership in the church. And so, Dr. Callahan, I wanted to ask you to start this discussion. What is the importance, or is there an importance of visibility in achieving full inclusivity?
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Thank you, Dr. Mickle, for your wonderful book and for the questions that your book has raised, and Dr. Thompson for the question that you're raising now. And of course, it's really a privilege and blessing to be on this panel with such stellar leaders and clergy persons. So as you were talking, it occurred to me that part of the the importance of visibility really has to do with our capacity to acknowledge the labor that has already and always been done. You're combing through the documents to think about who was present at the founding of the convention, whose name got written down. Of course, we know that were it not for women, there would be no progressive convention because there would be no Black church. None of our churches would survive. And it's not those of us who lead churches, we're not the ones who are keeping things moving. And that's always been true. And so I think part of the dynamic of visibility is simply to acknowledge the labor that has already gone on, you know, and to allow the people who've been doing the work to actually be acknowledged for their leadership and not just rendered invisible.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dr. Brenda Gerton Mitchell, growing up in the convention, because I think I started coming to PNBC when I was a teenager, and there were faces I remember and names that I can call. Yours is one of them, along with Reverend Dr. Brenda Little, God rest her soul, and Dr. Prathia Hall, God rest her soul. And even though she didn't acknowledge herself really as clergy, she was clergy. Reverend Dr. Thelma Chambers Young, who was married to Reverend George Young, and I think they were both in Oklahoma, and so many other names that I can call. You also have been coming and attending convention for a while. So would you think, or would you say that there's been any progress made as it relates to the visibility of women in ministry within Progressive?
Well, my diplomatic answer is a little. My truth-telling answer is no. Because if you look at it in terms of metrics, by now, recognizing that our churches would not have made much progress at all if all the women decided to boycott, to stay home, to not give. If we were that kind of spirited people, then our churches would not have advanced very far, in my opinion. I think what has helped us is to recognize, even the few of us that may have done it, that we have to have our voices. If we all take our balls and go home, so to speak, our pennies and go home, our dollars and go home, then we're not helping to advance the cause. We are not leading in a progressive way. So if I've made any contribution at all, it's to be in that background, pushing people to say, let's not just get mad, let's get busy. Let's demonstrate through our actions that the larger concern is lifting up God's church, still bringing people to Christ. And is it Christ-like just to get mad and go home? I think God expects us to add our voices to the vision of creating the kind of church that honors God for everybody. And recognizing that our assignment at different times, sometimes it's to push somebody else out front, sometimes it's to challenge the things that are, to be able to say, as we've done in some of those midnight hour meetings, look, we got to get this guy to stand up and say something, to just open the door for the conversation to begin. So that's my experience. It's hard. It's like working with white people around anti-racist work. It's as hard. But that we can't just beat them up and think that that's going to change the outcomes. It's not going to change the narrative. It's educating us around how God's word is the living word. And if we're going to let the oppressed, and we see ourselves as oppressed in the Black church, then we cannot have a victim's attitude. We can't get to victory unless we're adding our voices and being as visible as possible. Just staying in the work as hard as it is, but building allies along the way. So I think that Progressive is at a place that is beginning to build the allyship that we need with women to create a stronger organization. And I thank Dr. McMichael. I heard him at the last in-person meeting. I said, he's got to be one of our champions. If we don't have Black men saying we're doing this wrong, we sisters will just keep talking to each other. And those of you who have been called to pastorates um, will just be the few as opposed to creating the opportunity for the many.
Absolutely, absolutely. One thing you mentioned were the midnight meetings and the work that takes place that people don't see. And Dr. Taylor, I remember you telling me a story about a midnight meeting that took place with Reverend Dr. Brenda Gerton Mitchell and Reverend Brenda Little. And I think you said Dr. Otis Moss Jr. So if you don't mind, as historian, do you mind just telling us the story briefly of how you all were able to get a resolution to the national floor as it related to the role of women in the convention? You have to unmute yourself so we can hear you. This is a good story, so we got to hear it.
Yeah, this indeed is a story. Thank you, Pastor Thompson, and to all of my sisters and brothers in the ministry. There was a midnight meeting. Indeed, it is not just a metaphor. It really did happen, as they say, Paul said, long about midnight. It was a group of us women got together, namely with Dr. Brenda Little leading it. And it started something like this. And Dr. Mitchell, you were there. You were part of that. We were in Houston. And it is, why are women not a part of the larger part of the body of the convention as it relates to leadership, and women being a part of the preaching hour and other parts? So Dr. Little did a lot of, she did a lot of workshops and things of that nature, always mentoring women. And if I may, Pastor, I would just like to read a couple of paragraphs from this 43rd, I still have it, have it here, from the 43rd convention. It goes something like this, and it'll give you a flavor. Whereas for 43 years, PNBC Incorporated has been building bridges for justice and equality for all, and we put that in caps, African Americans in the areas of education, economics, fair housing, health care, and other areas where justice has been denied. Whereas, I'm going to skip some of it, PNBC clergy women have not been afforded equal opportunities to participate in, again, caps, all PNBC leadership positions. And whereas the PNBC affirms training for ministers' wives, the seminar is sexist in that it does not acknowledge males as spouses of women, pastors, thereby eroding the support for holistic family development. And it goes on to say what we wanted. That was a midnight conversation. It was a midnight meeting. At that time, Dr. Jemison was the president. Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. was there at midnight. We were in the auditorium, and we made a decision that we were going to come from the floor and ask for a resolution to be read. It was not part of the agenda, mind you. So Dr. Little and myself, collectively, after midnight, we wrote a resolution on equal opportunities for clergy women within Progressive National Baptist Convention. Well, it was so wonderful of Dr. Otis Moss Jr. He took the mantle. We went to him and he said, I will read it tomorrow morning at the convention during the business session. And he read that resolution with such conviction. And he said, how can we, these words still resonate, my sisters and brother. He said, how can we call ourselves progressives and leave the women out? He said, and so therefore, he said, the therefores, he was presenting this resolution. He said, I would just like to see who could stand and say they are against women when they are so much a part of us. Well, need I say, no one stood against us. That's something that happened at midnight. we are still waiting on some things to continue. There has been progress. For those that don't know that backstory, work that we did, you may not know how women have worked hard for some that are now in those places to come along. There was
Right.
work such as what Dr. Brenda did, Brenda Gurt Mitchell, myself, and Dr. Brenda Little for sure. God rest her soul, and she ended up being the first female to preach in the minister seminar. I make a
Yes.
distinction from just being the first woman to preach at PNBC.
Yes.
It's really good to know this history,
Mhm.
it makes us
And
a
I wanted you to raise it because it raises another issue, one that Dr. Brenda Gurton Mitchell kind of alluded to, and one that you have absolutely illuminated. And I wanted to pose this question to Dr. Gina Stewart because we share similar backgrounds, and she was such a personal blessing to me in the process of becoming senior pastor. I didn't realize our histories and our stories were so similar. And they were similar because we both speak of having fathers in ministry who were supportive of us personally, but also advocates, strong advocates of women in ministry and advocates of us. And so I wanted to ask you what you felt about the importance of our male clergy partners, our brothers and our uncles and our fathers in ministry, in this conversation, in this fight for full inclusion, whatever that's going to look like, not just for PNBC, but honestly for Baptist denominations around the world.
yes.
So thank you, Dr. Thompson, and good evening to all of my colleagues and co-laborers in ministry. And good evening, Dr. McMickle. We thank God for this time and this very critical conversation. I would say that male allyship, as Dr. Brenda Gurton Mitchell has already alluded to, is essential. As you've already stated, Dr. Thompson, you and I are proof of what happens when you have men who will assert their privilege in spaces that are primarily male dominated and where the boundaries are not necessarily permeable and where there has not necessarily been a commitment to egalitarianism. I am proof as the pastor of the church where I grew up all my life, that when there is male allyship, it's amazing what God can do when others work in cooperation with God to open doors for women. It was because of the allyship that I had from my pastor and allyship from other male clergy, actually, in the city. There were many in the city of Memphis, even when I was called to pastor Christ Missionary, who were not only supportive in front of my face, but also we need allies when we're not in the room. It's one thing to be an ally when you're in the room. It's another thing to be an ally when you're not, or an advocate when you're not there to speak up for yourself. And having men in ministry, men who work in ministry, men in leadership, as Dr. Taylor mentioned with Dr. Moss, who raised the question, how can we be progressive and not include women? It's very essential, I believe, for full inclusion of women and for systemic rather than symbolic change. Because we often think that if we get one woman, then we have arrived, but we want more than symbolic change. Systemic and structural change is going to, by necessity, require that the brothers assist us and speak up for us and stand up for us and fight for us.
Thank you so much. You are absolutely right. And you alluded to something that Ambassador CJ, I want to pose to you. One of the PNBC pastors who has been faithful, I can always remember her, Pastor Christine Smith, who pastors, I think it's pronounced Wickliffe, Ohio. She is senior pastor there, and I think she was ordained or installed by Dr. McMickle. She wrote a wonderful book called Beyond the Glass Ceiling, the stained glass ceiling. And she mentions this concept of a stained glass ceiling being this impenetrable force that women often aren't able to get through unless there are some challenges in the organization. So if the membership is dwindling or if the finances are challenged, then, you know, somebody's likely to kind of let you slip through a crack in hopes that you might be able to save the organization. But you are certainly one who I would dare say not only has cracked, but shattered some stained glass ceilings. And so what would you speak to female clergy and to male clergy of PMBC as it relates to addressing what she really defines as the evil of the stained glass ceiling?
Well, thank you again for the invitation and for the question. I just want to continue with Dr. Stewart's comments that we have to make systemic changes and strategic changes. Otherwise, the system will be evil, and evil can be overcome with light, but it takes strategy. It takes allyship of men and women working together. So it's not just men speaking for us, but speaking with us, so that we have voices that are not just visible, but that are viable, that they take us seriously as their colleagues, not someone that they're trying to help cross the finish line, but that's someone who's been working side by side with them for kingdom building. So until we recognize that it's systemic evil, just as racism is, as Dr. Gert Mitchell talked about, then we're still just treading water. I mean, we had midnight meetings with Hampton Ministers Conference. So as Dr. Taylor was talking, I was just reminded, but it took 26 years for a woman to get to the presidency. But it was women who came together with men who had been part of the system who said, we're going to work with you, walk with you. And once you got someone into the strategic system as the necrologist at that point, then we were able to rise up to presidency. It's a shame, you know, it took Israel 40 years to get freedom, a journey that should have only taken 11 days. This is my 40th year in ministry, and it's sad that we're still having to wrestle with the same argument in the 60th anniversary. It's at some point we should have progress. That's what progressive means, that there should be progress, and we should not just be staying put, staying in motion. So we've got to get beyond the Red Sea. We got to get beyond the Red Sea. We've got to cross the Jordan. And it's time, with new generations of women coming in and new generations of men coming in, it's time to cross the Jordan. No more staying on this side of it saying we have to do this. No, we want to do this. And I think with us collectively doing this, with our allies, such as Dr. Marvin McMichael and others, we will cross this finish line. That's what I think we have to do. Shatter, not just pity pat, but shatter the ceiling forever.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that. And we certainly, if you go throughout the history books, Dr. McMichael, I came across a letter from past President Dr. Earl L. Harrison, who was also previous pastor at the church I served at in DC, Shiloh Baptist Church. And he wrote a letter to the convention, and the letter basically said, take the chains off the women. Because back then, that men even had control of the women's department. And he noted what Dr. Callahan noted. He said that our churches are mostly women. Our convention is mostly women. Why don't we, you know, take the chains off the women? And then interestingly, Dr. Vincial Booth, who is considered the founder of PMBC, when he wrote reflectively around the 40th anniversary, one of the things that he said PMBC needed to do in the 21st century to be relevant was to utilize its woman power, was the phrase that he used. And so I'm passing the baton to you because you wrote an incredible chapter around what it means to be progressive Baptist, and you've certainly featured and listened to these women. That chapter, you featured some of the women who are here tonight. And so I'm certainly thankful and grateful to you for joining us as someone who is an ally and an advocate. And I also call the names of men like Dr. Earl L. Harrison, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr., Dr. James Perkins, who initiated the Women in Ministry Initiative, Dr. Timothy Stewart, who has continued that initiative and who is committed to moving us forward along with others. So don't be offended, gentlemen, if I didn't call your name. I love all y'all. I'm just calling who I remember in this hour. But I want to pass the baton to you for the second half of this conversation around what it means to be progressive Baptist at this hour. And thank you for such a wonderful, timely, critical book as always.
Thank you, and thanks to all of the persons on the panel who are featured in the book. Dr. Gina Stewart, Dr. Suzanne Johnson Cook, Dr. Leslie Callahan, and yourself, Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, among others. I said in that book, and I want to piggyback on something that Ambassador Suzanne Johnson Cook said, I did not want to do the talking in that chapter. I did not want to speak for women. I wanted to give 11 women a chance to speak for themselves. And so I contacted each one of you directly, got your consent to participate. You then wrote your own statements and you sent them in. And the only thing that I had to do with it was to make sure that it fit within the word limit that Judson Press had allowed for that chapter. But I want to thank each one of you on this conversation tonight for your incredible contributions, because you've told your own story. I must tell you, as a male person in clergy, I continue to be brokenhearted and distressed and distraught that in 2021 we are having a conversation about whether or not there ought to be room for women in the ministry in the Christian church. And so I want to shift gears, if I could, Dr. Thompson, with a quote. It's found on page 144 of the book. I'm going to hold the cover up for those who perhaps have not seen it. This is a shameless bit of self-promotion, but you got to sell these books. And in this book, Let the Oppressed Go Free, I quote one of my doctoral students. She's now graduated and gone on to do wonderful things. Her name is Jamie Eaddy, E-A-D-D-Y. Her dissertation dealt with microaggressions that women experienced over time in ministry. Not one big thing that happens to them all at once, but many aggressions, M-I-N-I, many, not several, but small, tiny cuts here and there. And she said this, and I use this as the beginning of our second part of our conversation. She's writing to Black male clergy when she makes this statement. She says, if your fight for liberation stops once you are free, meaning from racism, then it wasn't liberation you wanted at all. It was privilege. If the only thing you want is to be free from your particular form of oppression, but you don't care that oppression continues for other people who are facing other obstacles, obstacles of gender, obstacles of economic class, obstacles of sexual orientation, or in the case of Native Americans, obstacles in terms of a very different ethnicity and a very different historical narrative. If Black men are content to be free or to fight against racism, but they're not interested in, they're not willing to, they're not prepared to commit to all the other forms of oppression, then I think the word progressive does not fit. This is a question of intersectionality. I'm reading Stacey Abrams' book, Our Time Is Now. And throughout that book, she's making the case for this intersectionality, that people who are impacted by race are often impacted by gender, are often impacted by class. And you can't fight one battle. You've got to fight all of these battles. So I want to ask, perhaps beginning with Dr. Stewart, to talk to us a little bit about your experience with intersectionality, you know, to be both a person of racial definition and gender distinction. How do you see these intersections of race and class and gender playing themselves out in 2021?
Well, I'm sorry. Thank you for the question. I think we see it in every arena. We see it in the church. We see it in society. We see it in politics. We see it, as we've talked about, even in our religious organizations and institutions, that in most instances, For those of us who are female, who are also Black, we also encounter this triple jeopardy, if you will, of racism, classism, and economics that intersects. Because oftentimes, not only are we oppressed in terms of positions and status and opportunities for leadership because of our gender and our class, but we're often paid less than most our counterparts in just about every field. We can check the statistics. This is not speculation. This is not something we're making up. There's data to support that there are disparities as it relates to women in just about every one of those areas, whether it's class or finance or in those leadership positions. And even if we're in the leadership roles in particular, we are still lagging behind our male counterparts as it relates to compensation. I'm certain that if we were to talk about salaries just in ministry, or even honoraria in ministry, for example, and we were really to tell the truth about what's in those envelopes, we would find that there are probably disparities when it comes to that. And so it is an ongoing challenge and struggle, even in leadership, even in ministry, and even as we work in public institutions. Before I started pastoring full-time, I worked as, excuse me, a director of admissions for a community college. And some of the same challenges that I experienced as a pastor, I experienced those in that particular setting. In fact, one of my, the dean of admissions, actually a woman, Mary Cole Nichols, actually went to bat to fight for my salary, because I was in a position where I was classified incorrectly, doing the work of a professional, but classified incorrectly. But thank God for a woman who was willing to go to bat for me and advocate for me and receive that salary adjustment. Had it not been for somebody like Mary Cole Nichols speaking up for me in that particular instance, when I left, I probably would have never, by the time I left, I probably would have never seen an increase in my income. And so it's a real challenge, ongoing challenge, I would say.
Bless you, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, I quote from the Progressive National Baptist Convention's Constitution. I'm not sure if all of us have ever been able to read it, but among the things that the Constitution says is that anyone who is a member of the Constitution is qualified to run for any office in the Constitution, in the convention, and that includes the office of the president. You can be male or female, that's in the Constitution. You can be clergy or laity, that's in the Constitution. So the question becomes, if in its founding, if in its origins, PNBC said that anybody who is a member of the convention can contest for its offices, then why have we not yet gotten to the point that either a lay person, because the Constitution allows for that, or a female person, lay or clergy, has not yet managed to survive that gauntlet? And perhaps Dr. Callahan, you could take the first swing at that, and I'll give all of us a chance to pick apart why it is that the Constitution provides what the convention denies.
I think that's a wonderful question. I think it gets to the issue of intersectionality that you pointed out, and the complexity. And in this particular instance, is the complexity around what it means to be in a profession that is gendered. The profession of pastor in particular is gendered male in the minds of most people. I'll never forget, I'd been the pastor of St. Paul's a long time. I mean, relatively long enough for people to be used to my being the pastor. And they went to singing "Somebody Prayed for Me," had me on their mind. When they said the pastor prayed for me, they said he had me on his mind, right? They didn't make that mistake with their mother. They knew their mother, you know, they had a capacity to sort of move the gender thing around as it applied. I think we have to attend to the reality that we are in, and there are several of these professions that are still gendered. Teacher is gendered female until you get to the point where you start to making money. And then when you get to professor, that's gendered male. If you close your eyes and say, what does the doctor look like? Even most of us, even if you have a doctor who is female, when you close your eyes and think of what does a doctor look like, you see a man. I think we have to attend to that. We also have to attend to the reality that leader is often gendered. And that when people look for someone to lead, they frequently are looking first at men. I know all of us on this panel have heard the story about, well, the men wouldn't go, and so the Lord called the women. Because the assumption, even of people who sometimes who are trying to be supportive, is that the first choice for leadership. And so at the point that you get to the convention level, and then of course, whatever you call, there's a kind of clerical predisposition. The leader of churches are clergy. The leaders of churches are clergy. So that's why you don't get lay leadership at this level. So I think that we have to confront the reality that these defaults exist so that we can switch them off. I think as it relates to lay people, I think we've got to deal in our churches with authoritarianism that often, I mean, sometimes we, and some theological problems that we have with the leadership of people who are not clergy. Like some of us still really believe God doesn't talk to anybody but us. And too often, even those of us who are left out in one area, which is the thing that Dr. Edie's thesis was trying to get at, even when we've been left out of leadership, even when we've been left out of spaces of authority in one area, once we get authority, we often are very quick to leave people and lock other people out. And so I think we've got to begin to acknowledge that these, again, defaults exist. And then we've got to work on them. And wherever it is we sit, I guarantee you there's a default that we could be working on.
Thank you. Dr. Gerton Mitchell, would you like to talk a little bit about your experience with PNBC and why the convention provides, what the Constitution provides, but the convention denies?
Thank you, Dr. McNichol. Yes, the systemic barriers that are created by our own documents and by tradition would strangle the life out of us if we don't change them. We have even simple bylaw and constitution changes that have been proposed that end up dying for lack of a second, so to speak. The requirement to be a 1% church. Now, all of that about whether women or lay people can rise to office. Well, but if you're not a 1% church, you're not eligible to run. Well, what is a 1% church? And who's making that up? And so we have these built-in rules that the old guard is still protecting. And each year, each week, we're having to chip away and challenge that in them because it's so rigid. So this kind of conversation, the progressive hour, if it doesn't do anything else, has allowed us to put in the public domain for people to hear what we're doing, what we look like, and what we feel like as an organization without having to, beat it into somebody's head.
Yes.
And so that we can all collectively start to challenge even our own rules and regulations. We're holding people out. And the last thing I want to say on this point is that the last in-person convention, we got Dr. Thompson to agree to challenge the position for second vice president, I think it was. And we found women who were saying, but that's not the rules. That's breaking the rules. And I said, sometimes you got to break the rules in order to make change. What if we hadn't broken any of the rules around slavery? What if we hadn't, and I found myself on that stall with women who were not understanding that the status quo is not good enough. And if
Yeah.
we just wait our turn,
Yeah.
most of us will be in the grave before the next thing happens. So the traditions in our documents, we have to speak to those systems and be willing to help push the changes that are necessary.
Ambassador, this next one is for you. And it's a segue from what we just heard from Dr. Mitchell about waiting your turn. You've got some experience with these succession rules. William Augustus Jones Jr. decided that he was going to be the president. He was the president of the Eastern region, and I think he just skipped at least being second vice and ran for first vice. He may even have run straight for the presidency. In the book, I make the following argument. We can't afford to wait another 8 years to do this. 4 years as the second vice president, 4 years as the first vice president. Why don't we do what James Clyburn of South Carolina is asking to be done about voting rights and the filibuster? Why don't we have a carve out for this coming election and say, given the history of exclusion and given the fact that, again, to quote the title of the book by Stacey Abrams, Our Time Is Now, why should we not go to the floor of the convention and ask for a carve out?
Totally agree.
do
Now is the time. It's our turn. We cannot wait 4, 8 years or months. That we should be strategically planning now. And we stand just like it was in that Constitution that someone can stand on the floor. I think we need to make sure that that happens. And she's got backup. Don't put someone out there by themselves. Strategy means she's got backup. Sister back up, brother back up, that we stand with her and we all vote with her and for her. So I think we plan now, we begin to make that happen. We don't have enough, I certainly don't have another 4 or 8 years. I'm in the senior side of the sunset, as they say.
Yeah.
It's about legacy. And I want to thank God for Thelma Watson and for Prathia Hall and for Brenda Piper Little and other names whose names we don't even know that were there. But we should not have to repeat what they did some 4 decades and 5 decades ago. The time is now. It's our time. It's our turn. I stand with that agreement, in agreement with that suggestion. And she's got sister back up from this sister, Sujay.
And brother back up. And brother back up. Listen, I just want to put this conversation out there. I want to say, as a member of the convention since 1974, and I've seen it go from 2 2-year terms to 2 4-year terms, this idea that nobody can break succession. So I want to say to our national audience of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, let's be prayerful about this and see whether or not we have the courage to imagine a different future. All of you know the name of Walter Brueggemann.
Yes.
And all of you know his distinction between royal consciousness and prophetic consciousness. Royal consciousness, which is the way of thinking that maintains the status quo for the benefit of those who are already in power, and prophetic consciousness, which imagines a different future for the benefit of those who've been locked out that God is trying to move in. This question is for you, Gina Stewart. How do we move Black Baptist people from royal consciousness to prophetic consciousness?
I'll answer that question based on personal experience. And one thing that I do believe is that your structure can inhibit progress. So often our institutions are guided, our institutions don't guide the structure, but the structure guides our institutions. And in many instances, it keeps us from progressing and making those changes. And so we may have to take a serious look at those guidelines, if you will, that guide the organization. As you just said, it may be time to look at the Constitution,
Yeah.
or look at what is guiding the Constitution in order to make the types of changes that we make, because otherwise you keep defaulting back to the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is why we're having this conversation about a carve out, because we have written discrimination into our structure.
Exactly.
We have written oppression into our structure.
Exactly.
And our theologies also undergird oftentimes that oppression. And so perhaps one of the challenges is to revisit why the Constitution doesn't allow, or why the convention, I forgot what your original question was.
Yeah, the Constitution provides, the convention
provide
denies.
what the convention denies. And so the other problem that you have, I would say, is probably an oligarchy, a rule of the few, that often make the decisions that everybody else abides by. It may not be the will of the people. But because there is a small group of people that make the decisions, and because the people often are not empowered to say or do what they think is best, the status quo remains. I was thinking, as you were talking about doing a carve out for a Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, about a conversation when I attended Progressive several years ago, probably about 15 years ago, and Dr. Henry Mitchell and Dr. Ella Mitchell were giving greetings during the minister's seminar. And Dr. Mitchell said then that he was disappointed with Progressive because we had not lived up to our name.
The last convention that we had live, when Jacqueline Thompson and Gary Simpson allowed me to share with them in the minister's division, I told the story of having gone down to the FedEx office in the hotel. And I saw some people who were there in the convention and some folks who were there for other groups. And someone asked a member of our convention wearing a name tag what the meaning of progressive National Baptist was. They said they've heard of Southern Baptists, they've heard of American Baptists, they've heard of National Baptists. They wanted to know what the progressive part was. And I really paused to see what these people would say about being progressive. And guess what I found out? They didn't have a clue about why we call ourselves progressive. Tell us, if you will, from your experience and your history and your perspective, why did we become progressive Baptists in the first place? And how did we lose our way to become just another Baptist convention that's stuck in the rut of the status quo? Dr. Martha Taylor.
Wow, Dr. McMickle, that's a question there. In terms of progressive, we may recall the beginning of the Progressive National Baptist Convention was to break up term limits. It was when I believe Dr. Jackson had been president for a number of years and had the right to be until. And so that's when Dr. Gardner Taylor and others came together, and they indicated they would be more progressive without really giving definition, or, as I would say, exclusion of women in the process. Oftentimes when we talk about progression, we really are talking about a few, and Dr. Callahan stated a number of times using the word, it's gendered. I do recall when Dr. James Perkins, we were in Houston, he was not the one next in line to be president. It was Dr. Stewart at that time, Dr. Timothy Stewart. From the floor, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Sr. stood up and nominated Dr. Perkins, which he would have come at a later time. The vote was taken and the chain was broken. Dr. Perkins succeeded becoming, the next president. So I just want to say to this group, it has been done. It has been done from the floor. And if we did it again, it would not be the very first time.
Thank you. My sense, and I'm going to get
I
ready
just
to
want us
pass
to
this.
know that we would not be breaking any rule.
Yeah.
We would be following something that has been established for a male.
Yeah, yeah. And for Bill Jones as well back in the 70s. So it's happened twice.
Exactly.
The other progressive piece was, of course, is that because J.H. Jackson was deeply jealous and resentful of Martin Luther King Jr., he essentially froze Dr. King out of the life of the convention, even taking away from him his leadership role in the Congress of Christian Education. And so part of our progressive nature was our willingness to provide a platform for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So progress within the church, let's move in the direction of civil disobedience and the fight against racism. But we've stopped in time. We've frozen what it means to be progressive solely around the issue of race. And the truth be told, when I first started, there was a freedom night on Friday night given over entirely to the civil rights movement. That's now been abandoned. And so I don't know, we've settled the issue of tenure. Nobody serves for life. Dr. King is long dead. What is it now that makes us progressive? And Dr. Thompson, I'm going to give you the question, and then you can sort of wrap up our discussion. If we're not fighting about racism because, that was our founders' battle, if we're not fighting about tenure in office because we've already turned that corner, what would have to happen to make us progressive in the 21st century church?
I think there are several things that would have to happen. Thank you for the question. And I will note that part of what makes us progressive is the courage to have this kind of conversation now. The willingness to even admit that not only are we members of progressive, not only are we proud to be progressive, but we're able to recognize that to be progressive is not to be perfect. And so there are still issues of gender that we need to deal with. And I work with the youth and young adults. There are issues of ageism that we need to deal with. We have a wonderful, not a next generation, a now generation that has been active in the Black Lives Matter movement, that are leaders in other capacities, and we still treat them as a look and see group, entertain us, give you a night and showcase your gifts and talents, when these are actually people who need to be at our leadership tables, sharing with us, helping us. The pandemic proved it. We didn't know how to operate half of these Zooms and half of all of this technology, and we had to call in that next generation to help teach us. But not only can they teach us in technology, they can also teach us in ways of how to reach out to this new generation, this new world that we're experiencing. And whether we want to face it or not, we're going to have to deal with the issue of LGBTQIA. We're going to have to confront the issues that the people in our pews are confronting. We have to begin to deal with whether or not we are going to be a convention that is just concerned with convening, or whether or not we're going to be a convention that is concerned with equipping our churches. Lots and lots and lots of things that I think are driving us at this time.
I would make one more observation, and Dr. Callahan put this in the chat box. There's great wisdom in that suggestion. Maybe rather than sending you out as a sacrificial lamb, run a whole slate.
Let's run a slate
of persons who might collectively want to move us forward. I think you're exactly right. Issues that include younger persons, issues that you know, it's going to be, if we can't discuss women in ministry, when are we ever going to get around to sexual orientation in all of its complexity? And yet, just as you cannot have a Black church devoid of realizing the presence of women, you don't have a Black church that is ignorant of the fact that LGBTQ persons have been in our churches from the beginning, waiting for us to say that they belong to the church and don't have to hold their breath every Sunday to see what sort of attack they're going to have to endure. So,
and I would
thank
also
you
add
for
to
that.
wrestle with the issue of denominational relevance. We are living in an age and a time in dealing with a constituency that does not even see the idea of convening and coming together in the traditional way that we have done as relevant and necessary at this hour. And so if we are intent on standing on the principles that we say we were founded on and continuing to have relevance moving forward, what ways are we willing to shape and change and challenge ourselves to make sure that we remain the organization committed to the mission and committed to the message, even if the method has to change?
So you can close us out any way that you prefer.
Well, I'm certainly grateful and thankful to every single one of our dynamic panelists that have shared tonight, that have challenged us tonight in what has been an extremely provocative conversation. I pray that you have found it fruitful. I pray that it has caused you to think and perhaps to reflect on some of your own views and some of your own theology, some of your own understandings. We are thankful for their time. We're thankful for their sacrifice, but we certainly thank our president, Dr. Timothy Stewart, president of our steering committee, Dr. Ralph Canty, for allowing us to have this hour to begin this debate. This is on the precipice of the 60th celebration. And so we invite you to join us that first week in August for all of the activities that are going to be taking place starting Monday night, all the way through President's Night. We also invite you, I believe it's on that Wednesday night, we're going to have a banquet with our very own now Senator, Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock. All of this information can be found on PNBC's website, also on the Facebook page. You're invited to follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, all the social media platforms. But again, you are challenged, you are admonished. Listen to the women. And certainly as we close, we recognize it's not just female clergy, but even the women of the women's department that have sustained us, because for a while that was the only place we could go. And so we are grateful for the lay women who have labored and who have kept the ship afloat so that we might be able to have this conversation. So once again, we thank you. We pray you've enjoyed it. Share this live. Share this with someone. Don't just share it with a woman in ministry. Share it with a man that's in ministry as well. And we look forward to the time when we're able to gather again in person and contend with what it's going to mean to be progressive in the 21st century. God bless you all. Thank you again to Judson Press, and good night.